Good to see you, everyone. My name is Robbie Howell. I am a history enthusiast, game designer, and a lifelong lover of Age of Empires 2. And a couple months back, the commenter NC dropped me this little comment on screen suggesting I tackle the Scandinavian civilizations, which I have done. At least a third of them. I did the Swedes some months back. Go click the I button up here if you want to see that build. But since then, a fantastic commenter by the name of Johannes reached out to me saying that he, as a Scandinavian man himself, was very interested in participating in my builds for the other two Scandinavian factions. And as such, on today's episode of Theorycrafting, where I take a crack at designing civilizations not yet added to Age of Empires 2, we, alongside our friend Johannes, will be covering the Danes. As with the Swedes and any other Scandinavian builds, this Danish build will be derived from the current Viking civilization, and there will be some references to and elements of that current civilization in this build, but for the most part, it is largely original. If you want to see any disclaimers or an overview of my philosophy as a game designer, take a look on screen right now before we jump into the history section. Again, major credit to Johannes for helping guide me through Danish history. He knows an awful lot more than I did going into this. And as always, a link can be found down in the description to a civilization document containing all of my sources, all of the specific numbers and details on the build that I don't have time to cover in this presentation. And with all that being said, let's jump into the history of Denmark. So Denmark, or Jutland, was very much a crossroads of Northern Europe. It is a very fertile region and, of course, is a major thoroughfare for anyone coming in or out of the Baltic by sea, and for anyone going from northern Scandinavia to mainland Europe by land. The primary inhabitants of Jutland, the Jutes, a Germanic people, were greatly influenced by the many surrounding Germanic peoples who would often cross through their lands to interact with other tribal peoples of the day. One of the foremost themes in all of Scandinavian history is the three great Scandinavian nations of Norway, Denmark, and Sweden fighting each other an awful lot. This happened way before the AoE2 relevant timeframe and would happen all through the AoE2 relevant timeframe. So just assume that at any given point in Danish history, they are probably fighting with the Norwegians and the Swedes in some form or another. Got it? Good. Let's move on. So, like I said, Jutland was very much a crossroads in Europe, and many of the northern Germanic peoples, such as the Goths or the Lombards, linked to my video on them up here, would pass through Jutland on their way down south during the Great Germanic Migration. Other Germanic peoples would also frequently trade and interact with them, not to mention being frequently raided by them, and in the case of the Frisian Dutch, were even conquered and settled by Danish marauders early in medieval Dutch history. And so the Danes were a major player in Northern Europe well before they were even known as Danes. But that name would quickly become entrenched in European minds, as the 700s AD would see the beginning of the mighty Viking Age. The Danes initiated the Viking Age with their attack on the Irish Abbey of Lindisfarne in 793 AD, often being seen as the event that kickstarted the Viking Age writ large. And the Danes were a major player in the Viking Age. If the Swedes tended to handle most of the east of Europe during the Viking times, the Danes were the ones who handled most of the west. Not only did they obviously plague the British Isles for a great long time, they also sculpted much of the English language and British culture as we know it today. But the Danes didn't stop in Britain. No, they pushed far south, well into France. In fact, Danish Vikings even laid siege to Paris at one point during the height of the Viking Age and terrorized anywhere in the region that had access to a river. And much like the Swedes did in the east, the Danes profited massively off of their Viking excursions, bringing a lot of wealth back to their heartland, as well as settling much of the Netherlands, Belgium, and northern France. But this all happened when the Danes were still largely disparate as a people. This would all change in 960 AD when the Danish peoples Christianized and in so doing centralized under a single monarch. This great monarch would unify the disparate Danish diaspora into a single great North Sea empire, which held pretty much complete hegemony over northwestern Europe for about a full century before it fell apart. And a big reason why it fell apart was, of course, England being conquered by the Normans. They themselves, the descendants of Danish Vikings in northwestern France. But even with the North Sea Empire dissolved, the Danes still had plenty of power in their ancestral homeland. Though the Christianizing process that had led to a strong monarchy did dissolve many of the more proto-republican traditions that existed among many Scandinavian cultures, such as strong councils of freemen making decisions on everything from laws to foreign policy. More notably for Denmark, however, the breaking of this freeman tradition was part of what led the country into complete chaos for a good period of time. In fact, an 80-year civil war in which many different petty nobles began squabbling over the recently vacated throne, but an end was put to all of this by a fellow named Valdemar I, who thwarted the claims of his foremost other rivals, consolidated power within Denmark for the second great time, and created a new Danish empire, this being the Great Baltic Empire. Now, this Baltic Empire had even more sway than the North Sea Empire did centuries before, but it happened to have more of an eastern-facing focus. The Baltic Empire traded and conquered a great many peoples in the Baltic regions, locking horns with Polish and Germanic states, as well as crusading viciously against the Slavic Wendish people, and even as far east as the Livonian people of what is now Estonia. Much like with Sweden's crusades, the Valdemar military actions in the east were pretty much a continuation of the Viking Age and continued to greatly enrich the Danish kingdom under the guise of religious piety, which allowed the Baltic Empire to prosper until Valdemar's later descendants started to lose their grip on the throne and the conscience of their noble supporters, leading to another massive period unrest. This one even longer than the first. 150 years of social turmoil and civil war, often referred to as the kingless time of Denmark. During this period, pretty much every minor noble and his dog decided to try to set up a small state within Jutland, and in so doing, completely cast aside any hope that Denmark had to make an impact on the world stage during this period. And while the kingless time was ravaging Denmark, their southern neighbors in Germany were beginning to gain a lot of power. The Holy Roman Empire was waxing, and even after it dissolved, a great many Germanic states were left much, much stronger than they were during the times of Denmark's earlier imperial greatness. But once again, Denmark found a solution to this new coming threat, this time via the Kalmar Union. This is another thing I mentioned in my Swedish video, a consolidation of all three great Nordic powers under Danish rule. On paper, this was designed to resist the Germanic Hanseatic League, but in reality, it was mostly another way to have Danish hegemony wax in the region. But the Kalmar Union wasn't formed peacefully. Remember earlier when I said that Norway, Sweden, and Denmark were pretty much always fighting? Even though the current Danish royalty consolidated power not necessarily through conquest, but through diplomacy and intermarriage, a lot of the Norwegian and Swedish peoples they were assimilating were more than a little unwilling to be assimilated, leading to all sorts of rebellions needing to be put down. In fact, I think Stockholm held out for like a couple decades after the rest of the Union was officially formed, but form the Kalmar Union did. In so doing, giving Denmark its third major empire of the AoE2 relevant time frame, and a major empire it was. But as with Denmark's previous empires, the Kalmar Union was not to last forever. In fact, it collapsed in the early mid-1500s AD, leaving the monarchy completely hamstrung by a number of brutal deals that the other minor nobles of Denmark forced them to sign, kind of similarly to the Magna Carta that stripped the King of England of his absolute power. Additionally, Denmark was invaded by a great plague, Protestantism, leading to massive religious divides within the country. So between the Kalmar Union's collapse, the monarchy being crippled, and religious tensions, Denmark was plunged into another major civil war. After that point, the Danes would eventually decide to stop killing themselves and turn once again to their favorite punching bags up north. And that is where we will leave their story. But where are they now? What is Denmark like today? Well, if you're anywhere near Europe, you will know that Denmark is still a fairly major player in the European scene, and of note has the single longest unbroken monarchical line in all of Europe. The current royalty of Denmark can trace their bloodline all the way back to the original Christianization of the nation in 960, and probably before then too. And so overall, despite a fraught history and empires rising and falling, I'd say the Danish people came out on top in the long run. They're doing great today, and their monarchy still holds a direct tether back to their legendary history. With all that, let's move on to the flavor section. How would Johannes's and my Danish build actually look and sound in-game? Well, let's begin with the easy stuff. Their architecture would be Central European. They would have unique skins for the castle as a standard, as well as for the dock, which is, as you might expect, a pretty important building to the Danes. Their language would be Middle Danish, Værhilset, everyone, and their wonder would be Ribe Cathedral. This is a building that Johannes informed me of the existence of, and look at it, it's just absolutely gorgeous, and would stand out nicely against a bunch of the other current European wonders in the game. But how about for campaigns? What would a Danish flagship campaign look like, and who would it star? Well, the first obvious option is a fellow named Harald Bluetooth. Besides lending his name to the Bluetooth listening device today, Harald was Denmark's first king, the man who originally Christianized the nation, unified it under his rule, and went out a-conquering in Norway, England, and more. A campaign featured Harald would see the founding of the great North Sea Empire. There'd be a good amount of civ diversity, fighting the Britons, and the Celts, and the Norwegians, and the Swedes, and probably a few more besides, and you'd be able to have a nice hybrid of land-based and water-based play. In all honesty, he'd kind of be the perfect protagonist, but there's still a couple of cool other options I'd like to share with you. The next one, of course, being Valdemar the Great. I mentioned him a little earlier. He was the one who brought Denmark out of its first major unrest period and established its second great empire, the Baltic Empire. A campaign starring Valdemar would see you crusading against the Slavic Wends, fighting the Germans and the Poles, obviously fighting against the other Scandinavian powers, but that goes without saying, after starting out by beating your last two great rivals in contest for the Danish throne. In many ways, a Valdemar campaign would probably look very similar to a Harald Bluetooth campaign. I wouldn't fault anyone for picking either of these two great leaders as Denmark's flagship protagonist, but there is a third that I think is a little more underrated, that being Margaret I. According to one source I consulted, many historians call Margaret I Europe's first great queen. She was the power behind the throne who organized the Kalmar Union, effectively Denmark's third great empire. And though she herself was never directly coronated as the Union's sovereign leader, all of her people knew who was actually in charge, so much so that Margaret was referred to as the king rather than her son, who was technically the king, or her husband, who was technically king of Norway and Sweden. I know a lot of people want more female protagonists in Age of Empires 2, and I think that Margaret would be an optimal example of how to do one well, especially because she was such a brilliant strategic mind, using quick thinking, tactical know-how, and diplomatic brilliance rather than brute force to achieve her ends. In fact, she would be my choice for the protagonist of a Danish campaign, but I certainly wouldn't fault anyone for picking one of the other two. Let's move on to some of the existing campaigns that the Danes could appear in. And unfortunately, there's really only one, that being the York historical battle. This depicts Ragnar Lothbrok's initial invasion of England during the 700s and 800s AD, and Ragnar was in fact Danish. In fact, I think he would make a pretty interesting campaign protagonist in and of himself, but since York already exists as a historical battle, I did not want to throw him into the mix as a potential campaign protagonist. But unfortunately, besides that, there really aren't any existing campaigns that would really feature the Danes prominently, besides pretty much any of the Swedes campaigns that I mentioned in my video on them. Hopefully a Scandinavian civilization pack would open up the options for those a little bit more. Let's round it off with a couple more campaign ideas, namely Svein Forkbeard and Saint Ansgar. The former, Svein, was the son of the great Harald Bluetooth. He was also a very strong king and finished much of his father's work in founding the North Sea Empire, and I think that he would be a good, if somewhat derivative, protagonist. Most notably, though, he was at the helm of one of the most famous naval battles of European history, namely the Battle of Svolder around the 1000s AD, in which the Danes, Britons, Swedes, and Norwegians all clashed in a massive water battle right in the heart of the Danish Straits. It would be a sick historical battle, and if anything, I'd want to see that even more than I'd want to see a campaign for Svein Forkbeard overall. And the other funky option I have would be Saint Ansgar, the missionary who arguably single-handedly brought Christianity to all of Scandinavia, especially Denmark, where he is even today honored among the Catholic community. While he could make for an interesting campaign protagonist, I think even better would be a ludicrous-sized single historical battle that showed you kind of traipsing around all of the Scandinavian countries, steadily trying to win over pagans while securing funds from the papacy and the local German archbishoprics. Definitely a little bit offbeat. It's not really what you think of when you think of the Danes as a civilization, but I think it could be quite fun. Kind of reminds me of that one weird scenario in Age of Empires 1 where you start with only one priest and have to convert yourself an entire civilization. And with the flavor out of the way, let's wrap up the history section with a couple of the major themes that I identified while combing through Danish history with the help of my friend Johannes. First of all, internal turmoil. Denmark was constantly plagued by major bouts of unrest and civil war all throughout the AoE2 relevant time frame. Well over 200 years if you add it all up together. There were so many different noble families and minor factions that were all contesting each other to gain either absolute dominance or just separate themselves from whatever monarchy existed at the time. And I really wanted to try to find a way to represent this constant small-scale militarization within a Danish build. Second of all, Denmark has always had a massive economic hegemony over Northern Europe. As mentioned, they control all trade through the Baltic, both by land and by sea, and their power was such that they rivaled Germany on many occasions, at one point even being equal to the Holy Roman Empire itself, which, if you played the Barbarossa campaign, you know is nothing to sneeze at. Additionally, like Sweden, they got a lot of wealth through going out and plundering everything in the general vicinity, whether it be during the pagan Viking Age or during Christian crusades. Unlike what you might think of when you think raiders, they didn't just slash and burn everything they encountered. No, instead, they were smarter about it. They exacted tribute. They set up favorable legal conditions. And most importantly, they settled everywhere. Danish colonies cropped up in pretty much every single area that they plundered during the Viking era. You can still see their fingerprints pretty much all over northwestern Europe. And with all that, we finally come to the end of the Danish history section. Thank you so much for watching. If this was all you were here for, please remember to like and subscribe before you leave. And for all the rest of you who are interested in Age of Empires 2, let's dive into the details of Johannes's and my Danes build. Let's begin with a couple of necessary updates. As mentioned in the Swedes video, a Vikings split would necessitate a couple of new regional units for all of the Scandinavian civilizations. Starting with the Viking. This would be a regional unit that would replace your starting scout. And you could also train more from the barracks as early as Dark Age. The Viking is a good deal weaker than either the Eagle or the Militia, and though fairly fast, its speed is about a midpoint between those two units. It can, however, build long ships on beach tiles, allowing it a good deal of extra utility on water maps. What are long ships? We'll get to those in a second. Beyond that, the Viking has a number of useful abilities while raiding and harassing your opponent's economy. First of all, anytime it strikes a villager or other eco unit that is carrying resources, those resources are lost and added directly to your stockpile. Additionally, while a Viking is attacking an eco unit and certain eco buildings, such as town centers and monasteries, it will steadily generate gold. Much faster than something like a Keshik, but of course it's a lot harder to be hitting those sorts of units and buildings over a prolonged period of time. And lastly, if a Viking ever strikes a monastery that has garrisoned relics, those relics are instantly ungarrisoned. So a grab bag of funky little abilities that will be generally helpful in harassing your opponent's economy and benefiting you in the process. The Viking itself is fairly cheap, costing 50 food and 10 gold, and it is affected by supplies for -15 food cost, making it very spammable in late game. Though even when you upgrade it to the Elite Viking in Castle Age, its combat stats will still be pretty laughable in the face of anything besides trash units. Second of all, the Scandinavian civilizations receive the Longship. This replaces the transport ship for these civilizations and is available from Dark Age. In the Feudal Age, it gains a multi-javelin projectile attack. The longship is faster than a transport ship, but it is a good deal less beefy, and its multi-javelin attack is substantially weaker than that of a galley. It'll do better against fire ships than a galley, but still comfortably lose 1 versus 1 due to its relatively low defenses in comparison to a transport ship. It can transport as many units as a transport ship can, and it is fairly cheap, costing only 80 wood and 20 gold. You can also build them with Vikings in addition to training them at the dock, and in Castle Age you can upgrade them to the Drakkar, which, much like the Elite Viking, is decent, but much worse than a lot of your other water options if you're going for raw power. The longship's greatest assets will be its speed and versatility rather than its power in pretty much all circumstances. Before we move on, a huge thanks to the commenter Mike Oxsmall. You're a champ, man, and your Ock will always be large in my heart. He suggested a lot of the changes to the Viking and longship that you see on the screen before you. In my original Swedes build, they looked somewhat different, and I think that his input contributed massively to them looking the way they look now, which I think is much better than in my first draft. So thank you, Mike. Let's move on to an overview of the civilization. Johannes and I classified the Danes as a levy and naval civilization. Levy, if you're not yet familiar with the term, is my word for trash units. It wouldn't be very catchy to call it a trash civilization, and levies were mass conscripted soldiers that were often of relatively poor quality and are largely represented by the trash units we see in the game today. Let's go into the Danes' bonuses, starting with their town centers may train villagers while researching texts, including advancing to the next age. This is a very powerful eco bonus meant to somewhat ape the current Vikings getting free wheelbarrow and handcart. You'll be able to churn out a very powerful eco in comparison to other civilizations early game with this bonus, but it will cost you more resources, so you will have to adjust your timings slightly to make sure that you're maximizing the efficiency of your town centers. Second bonus, Danes repair ships for free and twice as fast. Currently, it is usually not a winning play to send villagers out to repair ships, even in early water fights, but with this bonus, you are pretty much always rewarded for having a villager nearby during fire galley fights and stuff in the early game. I forgot to mention, by the way, the Viking regional unit can actually repair ships, and this bonus would benefit them as well, meaning that your starting scout as the Danes can have a lot of impact on water maps just by being a ship repairman, which should give them a huge edge in early game water fights, much like the current Vikings do now. Third bonus, all Danish town centers and castles are constructed holding free levy units from Castle Age on, so this wouldn't count on Nomad. The exact numbers is like 3 for town centers and 5 for castles, and those are both doubled in Imperial Age. So you're not getting massive numbers with this, but it should still be enough to hold off enemies or maybe even mass up for a little bit of a sneaky raid if you're doing a massive 4 or 5 town center boom on a map like Arena. This bonus is meant to represent the constant militarization of Denmark during its many civil war periods, and lends itself to a really interesting booming plus raiding playstyle that I'm really hoping to promote with this particular design. Their last civilization bonus is that their Vikings can construct a number of buildings, specifically houses, docks, and town centers. While I don't see this bonus coming up quite as often as the other 3, it will still allow, for example, your starting scout to help you out if you get house blocked, or to throw up a dock on a map like Islands where the scout isn't really going to help you out too much after the first 5 minutes of the game. And we'll wrap it off with the Danes' team bonus, namely plus 25% enemy commodity trading fee. What the heck does that mean? Well, you know the Saracen bonus, the one that makes their market way better? This works like that in reverse. So all of the Danes' enemies have a much worse market and have a lot harder time getting good deals at the market even in the early game. This is of course meant to represent Danish economic hegemony, especially during, for example, the Kalmar Union and the Danelaw era in England. And though it might not always be the most impactful bonus, it will give them incremental advantage, especially in 1, the late game during major trash wars, and 2, during massive team games where markets tend to be used a little bit more and games tend to go a good deal later. If nothing else, it will screw up your opponent's timings if they're trying to do a fast castle market play thing. On to the unique unit. The Danish unique unit is the Long Axeman. This is of course in reference to the famous Dane axe, a 2-handed axe so long it was almost a polearm and was used very effectively to break enemy shield walls and clear the way for other Danish infantry during wartime. The Long Axeman would be a trash unique unit costing 50 food and 50 wood. It would have similar stats to a longsword, a little bit faster even, but it would have lower armor and worse rate of fire, so it would be far from a strict upgrade. The Long Axeman would also have an attack bonus versus other levy, namely trash, units, and it would have a little bit versus buildings. This means that the Long Axeman will be especially good in late game trash wars, and lastly, whenever a Long Axeman strikes an enemy levy, it will actually do a small amount of trample damage. This is too weak to be relied on in all cases, but will further exaggerate the Long Axeman's strength against enemy levy units, and also reward you for matching them up against enemy levies during mid and mid-late game battles where trash and gold units are heavily mixed, because the splash damage will hit stuff besides levies. Rounding off our overview, the Dane's unique techs are 1. In Castle Age, Danegeld. This nasty little technology gives you for the rest of the game a small percentage of all opponent gold income. Sounds terrifying, right? But I promise you, it's not that bad. It's about 5%, and it is averaged out across all enemies, meaning that it won't scale based on the number of opponents that you have. Additionally, Danegeld will reveal all enemy town centers, monasteries, and markets, giving you a bunch of fat targets for your Vikings, as well as a bit of incidental vision, also useful if your opponent is trying to hide from you and set up a sneaky base in late game. Like with spies, the enemy will get a little ping notification when you research Danegeld, so just know you won't be able to completely spring it on them out of nowhere. And lastly, in Imperial Age, the Danes gain the unique technology Lathing. This is perhaps their most powerful bonus, and it allows all of their warships and levy units to be trained 2 at a time. Literally 2 progress bars would display in a building, allowing you effectively 100% bonus training speed if you can manage to support the production. Remember, this only applies to warships and levies. Throwing in a cavalier or an arbalest or something will break the chain and prevent anything from being trained 2 at a time. So you have to be strategic with your production when you research this technology. And as always, if you want any more specific details on any element of this build, make sure to check out the civilization document linked in the description down below. Let's move on to the Danes' tech tree. As with my last couple of videos, we're going to be doing this Spirit of the Lost style with letter grades, beginning with the Danes' infantry. They are getting a B+. They have the Halberdier fully upgraded. They have their regional elite Viking, which has a good amount of utility, even if not power. They also have their mighty Long Axeman unique unit and the Lathing technology, which is especially good for their infantry since it hit both the Halberdier and the Long Axeman. That being said, they do miss two-handed swordsmen, meaning that their sword line is quite weak. Not the end of the world, especially since the Long Axeman is very good against trash, but it does mean they will have some serious problems against things like Eagle Warriors. Additionally, the Danes don't have any explicit infantry bonuses, and so between that and missing two-handers, I felt like a B+ was merited. Their archers are a B. They have Thumbring and Arbalester, allowing for very strong Castle Age crossbows, and they have all the archer armor upgrades, but they are missing Bracer. I know you guys love it when I make civilizations miss Bracer, and this will definitely make it such that late game elite skirmisher spam as the Danes is not nearly as oppressive as it would be otherwise. They are also missing Hand Cannoneer and Heavy Cavalry Archer, which aren't nearly as consequential as the Bracer part. Danish Cavalry scores a C+. They have Bloodlines for early and mid game stuff, and they also have Hussar for their late game Lathing spam, but they don't have Paladin, Plate Barding, or Husbandry, so their Hussars will be distinctly suboptimal. In late Castle, early Imperial, though, they can do decent work with their Cavaliers, and their Hussars, since you can make them so fast, will still be a good option if you want to go for them late game once you have Lathing available. Dane's Siege is a solid C. They do have Siege Ramp, they have Bombard Cannon, but they don't have any of the other important things you want for a Siege Civilization, nor any bonus even resembling a Siege bonus. So a straight average C felt fair for them overall. Danes have a B for defenses, no bracers hurts, and they don't have hoardings or treadmill crane, but other than that, they have a pretty much perfect university, as well as a couple of their bonuses, like free levies in town centers and castles, being incidentally useful on defense. Plus, Lathing, allowing for double production trash units, is going to often be better on defense than on offense, though not always. So overall, the Danes do have pretty decent defenses despite lacking the strong shooting buildings we normally associate with that sort of playstyle. But on to the good stuff. The Danes have an A- economy. Their unique technology Danegeld will net you a little more gold than most civilizations have to play with, and though they do miss both Goldshaft Mining and Two-Man Saw, they have the TC training bonus, they have Vikings that can build a bunch of buildings, they have their market bonus to keep the enemy weak, they have a lot of good economy stuff going on that should allow them to be very strong early and mid, even if they kind of peter out towards the late game. Their dock is where they shine. The Danes have an A dock without question. They have lathing, they have the unique longship, they have their Viking, and though they do miss Bracer, the fact that you can produce warships so fast should be enough to compensate for their relative lack of power and range. I should also note that they have a perfect tech tree in the dock, and their ship repair bonus will help out a lot during early water fights, and so in terms of their early dock, I'd say it's an A+ without question, and their late dock is maybe an A to A- because of missing Bracer, so averaging it out to an A. And lastly, the Danes have pretty unremarkable monks. I give it a C+. They do have Redemption, and that's pretty good, but they don't have Atonement or Theocracy or Illumination, so pretty much all you'll be using monks for is for arena shenanigans and to pick off onagers late game if you really need a counter to those. And that should give you an overview of the Danes' tech tree. You can see that they are definitely a bit of a jack of all trades, really relying heavily on lathing in post-Imperial Age once trash wars start to begin, but early on they have a lot of different options. They can play crossbows and knights very effectively in Castle Age, they have a bunch of raiding options in feudal and early castle as well, and their water game is impeccable. So you have a lot of different playstyles available to you as the Danes, especially before mid-Imperial Age hits. And that segues us nicely into the Danes' playstyle. As I just stated, you have a lot of options when you're playing the Danes, and the early game is no exception. You have every rush you could ever dream of, and you have Vikings at your disposal too if you want to pull off some high disruption eco shenanigans. But no matter what you do for rushes and raids, you have steady eco advantage if you're keeping your town center working during technology research thanks to your Vil training bonus. And so though it might be a little tricky to master the Danes' early game at first, it should leave you with a very strong advantage going into feudal and castle age, kind of like you would have playing the Chinese. Additionally, if you're on any kind of water map, the Danes have tons of options at their disposal. They will do very, very strong on early water, especially thanks to stuff like their repair bonus and access to the longship. Once you hit the mid-game, the Danes have a very good boom. As you are creating town centers, you get all of these free levies that you can use for defense or raids, but you can also even use them to help close out the game on the back of something like a castle drop. And like I said before, you have great crossbows and perfectly fine knights to play within Castle Age as well. So the mid-game will in general be pretty decent for the Danes as well, and you'll often be able to close things out before you even need to hit Imperial Age and start to rely on trash spam. But once you do hit late game, the trash spam comes online. With lathing at your disposal, you'll be able to make tons of units, and even though you'll be often relying on the long axemen and halberdier, your subpar skirmishers and hussars will be able to put in a little bit of work as well. Don't forget, on water, lathing also will help you just as much. In fact, it will probably be even more impactful since though they lack Bracer, their dock tech tree is incredibly strong. And so late game as the Danes becomes a matter of quantity over quality in a very big way. Your eco also does stay competitive with your market team bonus, keeping the enemies a little bit toned down as they're trying to churn out trash. And you also have Danegeld at your disposal to give you a little bit of pocket change as they are desperately scrabbling for the remaining gold on the map. And though I keep focusing on the trash and the relative weakness of their land units, you have some perfectly respectable options available to you in post-Imperial in addition to your main trash units. You have your elite Vikings, you have siege rams and bombard cannons, you have a bunch of different things to dump your gold into and to use as a control group 1 behind all of your trash units. So that should give you a pretty good picture of how I envision the Danes actually working in game. But before we wrap up this video, I want to, as always, touch upon some loose threads, lingering questions, and ideas that didn't quite make it into the build, but I felt useful to share regardless. Let's start with some uncertainties. I got some great feedback from Mr. Mike Oxenhall on the Longships and Vikings, but I could see them not quite being perfect yet. They are both very unconventional units, much like all of my Zapotec regional units from last week's video, and in particular, I feel like the Longship could be a little more unique than just being a multi-projectile fast transport unit like it is now. Like, for example, I debated giving the Longship a proper melee attack instead of a ranged attack for a very long time, and only kept it as the multi-projectile thing because a lot of people have told me that they really love how the current Longship plays, and I wanted to kind of emulate that, albeit in a much weaker fashion. Additionally, I'm not sure if the Danes, as they stand right now, are too defensive-oriented. Like, they have a big focus on the town center and kind of controlling the enemy, and while that's interesting and unique as a playstyle, it might not feel like Viking-y enough for people who are hoping to get the proper raid and pillage experience, if that makes sense. And lastly, they have a very open tech tree. That is by design, since the Danes were by far and away the most Europeanized of all the Scandinavian civs. but it might be too open to the point where it could feel a little bit bland or generic, I suppose. Let's get on to the fun stuff. The tabled ideas, some stuff that Johannes and I considered but decided not to go with for this particular build of the Danes. Beginning with stuff that gives you levies. We had this idea where more than just the castle and town center could have levies inside of it when they were built. We had an idea where when buildings were destroyed, levies could pop out. Where when villas die, they could have a chance to become levies. We just levies everywhere. We also had an idea for cheaper warships like the current Vikings to keep it nice and simple, but that's probably better suited for the Norwegians. Also, a really cool idea that I was very close to going with was having villagers be able to garrison inside of docks to make the docks train units faster. Very, very cool. This was something that I think lathing accomplished better. Additionally, in reference to the free wheelbarrow handcart thing, we had this idea where the first ecotech per age could be a lot cheaper and researched a lot faster, kind of Burgundians-ish in some ways. I like the simultaneous Vil and research thing that we ended up going with because it kind of plays into the double taskbar thing that lathing also does, as well as it being a lot more unique in skill testing, but this one was certainly an option on the table. We also had the more controlling-oriented ideas where like enemy buildings within a line of sight of any of your buildings would work slower, or enemy vills would gather slower, or other things to, again, kind of represent Danish hegemony. It ended up being a little too fussy and, again, more of a controlling playstyle than we were really hoping. Another option was to have lathing do all sorts of different stuff, like reducing levy and ship cost, or make it so that ships have free levies on them when created, kind of like town centers and castles do now. I'm pretty partial to the option that we went with. I forgot to mention in the unique technology section that lathing was the Danish coast guard, so to speak. It was actually a thing in all Scandinavian countries, but the Danes arguably had the best one. And it was effectively this like rapid conscription method wherein a bunch of local civilians and their ships could all be mobilized extremely quickly to help with Danish coastal defense or to assist in local raids and warfare. And so I feel like because of that, a training speed bonus was definitely the best way to implement this particular technology. Next, a couple of unique technologies we didn't go with. Svinfylking was a sort of spearhead formation, mostly used in shield walls, and this would be a footman bonus. Yes, my footman build. Something that the Danes would definitely gain access to. But at least for now, I want to keep my Civ Theorycrafts kind of separate from my unit Theorycrafts so that they feel a little more authentic to the game as we know it now, if that makes sense. Secondly, we have Handfæstning. These were the agreements that the Danish nobles forced the monarch to sign after the Kalmar Union dissolved. Again, that Magna Carta equivalent thing. And this would make it such that enemy fortifications are more expensive and take longer to build, represent the weakening of the monarchy after these agreements were struck. Another entry in the too controlling but still very interesting category. I would love this bonus for another civilization sometime in future. On a similar defensive front, we had one called Trelleborg fortresses. This was a kind of wooden fortification style popularized by Harald Bluetooth, and it would make it so that stone walls cost half wood. Pretty simple, honestly kind of shit, and way too defensive, so not this one, but a really cool piece of history. Danework, a similar kind of wall-oriented one, would give bonus wall line of sight and reveal enemy fortifications. The Danework was like a big fuck-off wall separating Germany from Denmark, kind of like Hadrian's Wall in Britain, and it was meant to give warning of incoming German incursions. And did it work? Not very often, and that's why this unique technology also kind of sucks. So let's not do this one. I like my bonuses being strong and fun and impactful, thank you very much, even if this was historically accurate. And lastly, a unique technology called Shipsoak. This was kind of a conscription agreement where any given Danish family would maintain a warship as well as a couple of able-bodied fighting men and sailors that could be deployed rapidly at any time, contributory to the overall lathing system. And Shipsoak would allow docks to train Vils and Vikings. Potentially very broken unless it was a Imperial Age unique technology. And again, it felt kind of derivative for lathing, while also being literally useless on maps without water. And with all of those tabled ideas out of the way, we come to the end of our Danish build. Thank you so much for watching. Before we sign off, let's take a look at the likeLyometer. In my humble opinion, how likely is it that a civilization called the Danes, looking somewhat similar to Johannes's and my build of them here, could appear in Age of Empires 2? And today, on the likeLyometer, we have a 6.5 out of 10. I think that the Vikings are an actually decent candidate for subdivision. Not soon, don't get me wrong, but sometime within the next 4 to 5 expansions, don't be surprised if the Vikings get split up. And if they do, the Danes are the obvious candidate, probably to take the mantle of the current Viking civilization as we know it. In fact, this build would have been a whole lot easier if I just kind of took the existing Vikings and tweaked them around a little bit, kind of like the Hindustanis filled the boots of the former Indians. But you know me, I like to overcomplicate things, and it's a whole lot more fun coming up with a bunch of unique ideas than just kind of rehashing old existing ones. And that's the build. Tell me what you think about it. I want to hear all about your thoughts down in the comments section below. And please give a huge round of applause to Johannes Eyjolfsson. He's a great guy. He did a lot of good help in this particular build, and you can look forward to seeing his name again when we eventually tackle the Norwegians in the not terribly distant future. But in the meantime, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this given build. What would you do differently? What did you really like? What did you really dislike? Any elements of the history that we screwed up on or you think we could have represented better? And lastly, I'd love to hear if there are any other civilizations, units, topics, whatever else that you'd like to see me tackle in a future video down in the comments section below. But until then, my name is Robbie Howell. Huge thanks to Johannes Eyjolfsson for his help with this build. And ciao for now.